Okay, lots to talk about, so let's get to our panel. With us is Anton Fedyashin. He is Associate Professor of History at American University. Joining me too here in the studio is Jeff Stacey. He is a former State Department official in the Obama administration. Joining us from Tampa is Mohsen Milani. He is Professor of Politics at the University of South Florida. And with us from Chapel Hill, North Carolina is Klaus Larres. He is Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina. Welcome to all of you to the show. Jeff, let's start here in the studio. Iran was one of the topics discussed by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo during his meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. And as we all are aware, tensions have been rising between Washington and Tehran. This is what Mike Pompeo said about that issue. Let's watch.
We're looking for Iran to behave like a normal country. And that's our ask, and we have applied pressure to the leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran to achieve that. We fundamentally do not seek a war with Iran.
So that's Pompeo assuring the world there that the U.S. is not seeking a war with Iran. But if we look at what's going on right now, there's talk of a revised war plan. There's also been reports of deploying 120,000 troops to the Middle East, accusations that Iran or Iranian-backed forces have been hitting shipping in the Gulf. There's been the partial evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. What's going on?
Well, it seems like Pompeo actually revealed his hand a few days ago when he said, we've been at this for quite some time. And that refers to the plans that he and John Bolton appear to have laid to start a march toward a potential conflict and see if they can woo Iran into a bit of a trap, and leaving the Iran nuclear deal as they've now said they're going to do, and possibly participating in what may be a Houthi attack on tankers in the Gulf, among other things. They may have already crossed a red line or two of this administration, so that's not good. Now, he's reassuring us at this meeting, Russia ultimately does not want a full-fledged war like this, but anything short of that, Russia is one of those advantaged by all the tension.
But Jeff, when you talk about trying to lure Iran into a trap, does that provoke Iran into doing something to attack American interests in the Middle East?
Sure, either harass the new Lincoln carrier and support ships near the Gulf or the Straits of Hormuz, or possibly fire something in the vicinity of one of the bombers that's now basically patrolling the area. Just something small like that could be all the administration is looking for to launch a more sustained attack in response. And that is what has Capitol Hill now quite up in arms on both sides of the aisle.
All right, let's go to Mohsen Milani. Mohsen, there's been a lot of saber rattling, as we've just heard, but in Iran, the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is downplaying the prospect of a confrontation. He said in a tweet this week, this is not a military confrontation because no war is to happen. We don't seek a war, nor do they. They know a war wouldn't be beneficial for them. What is your assessment of what is going on right now?
After the U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the Iranians were quite angry. And when Washington decided to impose real harsh sanctions on Iran and take a number of other measures to bring Iranian oil export to zero, the Iranians finally decided that their strategic patience has ended. And what was supposed to be a win-win agreement, win for Iran in terms of lifting up the sanctions, win for the West and other global powers in terms of restricting Iranian nuclear program, that win-win has become lose for Iran, win for the rest of the world. And therefore, the leadership in Iran has decided that the status quo is unacceptable, and they have threatened to take measures in violation of some potential violation of the nuclear agreement in order to send a signal to President Trump that the path that he has taken is unacceptable, but more importantly, to put a lot of pressure on the Europeans to deliver. Because as far as Iran is concerned, the Europeans are getting all the benefits of the nuclear deal, but they are unwilling to pay any price for it. And by price for it, I mean violating American sanctions and putting an end to the economic strangulation of Iran.
Mohsen, as we've been reporting, and there have been reports here in the United States about the military wanting to deploy up to 120,000 troops to the Middle East. President Trump has dismissed those reports. This is what he said.
I think it's fake news, okay? Now, would I do that? Absolutely. But we have not planned for that. Hopefully, we're not going to have to plan for that. And if we did that, we'd send a hell of a lot more troops than that.
So what do you make of that? Is that just Trump bluster? Because there seem to be confusing reports that we're hearing here.
From the time that the president ran for the presidency until today, he has been on record for saying a number of times that American wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq has cost more than $7.5 trillion, and they have been disaster for American national interest. He promised not to get involved in another never-ending war in the Middle East. Now, Iran is a country much bigger than Iraq or Afghanistan. Perhaps in terms of population, Iran has more population than Iraq and Afghanistan combined. It is a real country with a real military, with a real political system. And therefore, I don't believe the reports that we have heard that the two countries are on the verge of a military confrontation are accurate. I think there is a great deal of hype. What I'm afraid of, I don't think there is a potential of a full-scale war between Iran and the United States. The president has said so, and I trust him. His instincts are against war, and I respect those instincts. What I am afraid of is that there could be some misunderstanding, some accidents in the Persian Gulf, and then the president could be trapped, and he might take a decision to retaliate against Iran, and I don't believe Iranians are going to sit low and not retaliate back.
Okay, Anton, at that meeting in Sochi, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, he called for restraint. Let's watch.
I hope that reason would prevail, that the rumors about the alleged plans to send 120,000 strong United States soldiers, which we've discussed today, and Mike said was in the hands of the military, that those rumors are groundless, because the region is already overstrained by various conflict situations.
So what can Russia do to ease tensions between Iran and the United States right now?
The best that it can do is to do exactly what it's been doing for a decade now, which is to talk to all sides. As an historian, I look at what Russia's doing in the Middle East right now through a lens of several decades, going back to the Soviet Union. I have to say that the Russians have achieved unprecedented success in the amount of influence that they have in the Middle East. Back in the Soviet days, although the Soviet Union was behind the creation of Israel, it then made the catastrophic mistake of suspending diplomatic relations with it and then made itself hostage to Arab nationalism and radicalism. And Putin and Lavrov and all of his advisors seem to have learned from this very unpleasant experience. And Russia has made itself indispensable in the Middle East today. It talks to every single party in the Middle East, including parties that are diametrically opposed to each other: the Saudis, the Israelis, the Iranians, the Gulf monarchies, and the Israelis especially, of course. So what the best the Russians can do right now is to step back and act like adults, not make any sudden moves, and hope that the Americans don't blunder into another Iraq or Libya, except this time, as the previous speaker mentioned, the country is a lot bigger, the military is a lot stronger, and the repercussions will be a lot more serious. So the Russians are now playing the role of mediator, which is something that that was not part of the toolkit for either the Soviet Union or for Russia. Putin today hosted the president of Austria during the in Sochi, same place he met with Pompeo, and during the press conference, he let fall a very interesting phrase. He said that Russia is not a fire brigade to run around and put out fires that are being set all over the Middle East. It'll do its best to talk to everyone and to assuage the passions. But ultimately, it's up to the United States and to Iran to resolve their differences.
Right. Klaus Larres, you know, as we hear about these tensions escalating, people often talk about, could this be Iraq 2.0? Could this be Iraq Redux? Secretary Pompeo, he stopped off in Europe on his way to Sochi, But Europe's, at least America's allies in Europe this time, were calling for, quote, maximum restraint. How much concern is there in Europe over these escalating tensions?
There's a great level of concern in Europe. There's been an American obsession with Iran really since the 1979 hostage crisis, and that obsession has never really gone away. It has gone through phases, but it has always been there. And I also wonder whether the American administration right now is not deeply divided. You know, Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and Pompeo, the Secretary of State, clearly have a more hawkish attitude towards Iran than Trump himself has. As was said before, Trump really wants to withdraw American forces from the Middle East, from Syria, from Afghanistan, and from other places. He doesn't want to get more involved and more deeply involved with military force in the Middle East. So I do not think that it is Trump's first choice to get involved into a war against Iran. I believe he is, with his utterances, with 120,000 troop number which is being bandied about, that is all a threat, both a threat to Iran, not to start nuclearizing, not to start embarking on building its own nuclear weapon, but it is also a threat to the European allies not to cooperate with Iran, not to undermine the American-imposed sanctions on Iran, particularly not allowing Iran to export its valuable oil resources to Europe and therefore earn quite a bit of money from the European allies. And I think it is the American strategy to indicate to the Europeans, if you're not careful, if you move too close to Iran in at least economic ways, then war might be around the corner. It is a threat, and the Europeans are always easily impressed by the threat of war. That was the case in 2003 when Iraq was invaded and when there was huge opposition in almost all European countries, certainly among the population, and that is the case today. And I think, you know, it is really a play to impress the European allies not to cooperate with Iran in economic ways and therefore undermine the American-imposed sanctions.
What do you make of that, Jeff? Are the Europeans now between a rock and a hard place?
I think they're really upset is what they are. They don't feel so much pressured as really quite concerned that the U.S. could have it a rock too on their hands, and that's something that they're rightfully opposed to. I mean, the U.S. foreign policy establishment here in this town, that means Republicans and Democrats alike, do not want to see another conflict, Persian Gulf style, but this time another order or magnitude more intense and with more serious consequences. I mean, this would roil the Middle East for generations to come. It would put off any cooperation along the lines of the JCPOA for another generation or two. Now, if they go forward with regime change to decapitate this government and the Ayatollah Khamenei, all his advisors, everybody there, I mean, we were talking about a disaster of proportions that none of us can predict and probably would not end up in our interests or the interests of the Europeans. They will get swamped with refugees all over again. So everybody is trying to basically put brakes on this, including Democrats on Capitol Hill.
Right, yet, Jeff, John Bolton, the president's national security advisor, he openly talked about regime change in an address to an anti-Iranian group last year. So is there a division, as Klaus pointed out, possibility of a division in the administration right now, that this is being driven by John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, the president perhaps not too keen on?
I don't think so, because Trump has been anti-Iran from day one, early in the campaign. I mean, it was Flynn that put Iran on notice. I mean, even talking further back in the campaign about such things. So he's one of the three top anti-Iran hawks, the president himself. And despite the fact that I've heard a couple of my colleagues here today say that they think he's an isolationist and wants to withdraw from everywhere, he'll do whatever he thinks is in his interest with his base. He's already attacked Syria when nobody expected him to, and he hasn't withdrawn from either Syria or Afghanistan. And this is a guy who likes a big, strong military, and what are you going to do with that big, strong military but use it occasionally? And this might be the very thing that the three of them together are going to attempt to pull off. It's probably below them, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who are behind the scenes saying, wait a second, gentlemen, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Is this really in our interest? They're certainly hearing from allies, so there's a full-on sort of maneuver. Capitol Hill, allies, friends in the region, with the exception of the Saudis and UAE, who of course would like to see a conflict like this.
Right. Mohsen Milani, let's look at the situation in the region. Trump, of course, has cozied up to Saudi Arabia. He also has a very good relationship with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Both these countries, powerful countries in the Middle East, they're both very tough critics of Iran. Is there an attempt here to put the squeeze on Iran?
President Trump made his first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And I believe in that trip, the foundation of a very strong alliance among the United States, Israel, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent, the United Arab Emirates was formed. And this alliance is essentially designed to contain Iran and, if possible, to have a regime change in Iran. And I think if you carefully look at the division within the Trump administration, it appears to me that at least one faction, Mr. Bolton and Mr. Pompeo, would like to see either implosion inside Iran because of what they have been doing economically. You have to come to that conclusion. And if there is no implosion, if there is no disintegration of Iran, their hope is that at least we would see rising demonstrations that could lead to the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. I'm afraid this is more of an illusion than reality. Unless the U.S. Is determined to send hundreds of thousands of troops to Iran, I simply do not see how economic sanctions and pressure is going to lead to the disintegration and regime change in Iran. Moreover, I think people who are pushing for regime change should ask themselves what happened to Afghanistan, what happened to Iraq. Have we succeeded in overthrowing the Taliban and Saddam Hussein and get a much better deal? And what is the price that we have paid for that?
Anton, if there is any kind of military exchange between the United States and Iran, if there is an attack by the United States, what options does Russia have?
Well, not many, actually. Iran and Russia don't have a formal alliance. Iran's constitution forbids it to host foreign military powers on its territory. I doubt that the Russians are going to go in guns blazing on behalf of Iran. We have to remember that from Moscow's perspective, there is a certain cynical calculation about what goes on in the Middle East. And although the Russians clearly do not want another conflagration in Iran, which of course will affect their own Muslim neighbors to the immediate south and within the borders of Russia itself, but for the Russians, it is also somewhat advantageous for the United States to continue to apply a limited amount of pressure to Iran, because that makes the Iranians more malleable and more susceptible to Russian pressure and Russian demands on a whole range of issues. Let's remember that the sanctions on Iran and the total cutoff of its oil raises oil prices, which of course benefits Russia. In the mainstream media in the United States, we have become very used to hearing and reading that the Russians went into Syria to save Assad and to help Iran, when in reality, if you took a realistic approach to what's been happening in Syria, the Russians stepped in also to limit Iran's influence in Syria and increase their own, and they were very successful about that. Russia and Iran have many things in common, but they also have competing interests, and it is in the Russians' interest to witness the pressure and the tension in the Middle East, to play the moderators, but by all means, along with the Europeans, to prevent the United States from blundering into another catastrophe.
Klaus, other than calling for restraint, what can the Europeans do?
Well, they can, of course, talk to Trump, but they have very little leeway, really. And the Europeans realize that there is a desire for regime change in Iran, in Washington, but they very much hope that that will not be executed by military means. There is pressure by Israel on the American administration, and the Europeans will use their good offices in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, to undercut that. It is the Europeans have lost a lot of influence. We saw that Pompeo canceled his visit to Chancellor Merkel recently. Instead, he flew off to Baghdad, which he regarded as more important to talk about the Iran thing. So the Europeans really have lost an awful lot of influence. Trump will pay a state visit to Britain soon, but Prime Minister May has been much weakened by the Brexit disaster, so the British voice doesn't really count as much in Washington as it used to do. Also, there's problems in the trade war with China, where the British are perhaps less critical of Chinese companies like Huawei than the United States is, and that has also brought the British and the Americans apart from each other. The Germans, as I said, have lost much influence, and also France under Macron is not as influential with Trump than he initially was during the beginning of his presidency. So apart from admonishing the American administration, giving good advice, and also pointing out the consequences that a war in the Middle East would have, reminding America of the disastrous consequences of the Iraq war, there is very little they can do. What I would like to add is one has to wonder whether Trump's base would really favor another major war in the Middle East. Right. Would Trump believe that his base supports something like that? I wonder. So in the last resort, I would like to side with the other, my predecessors here, who are also very skeptical that Trump himself would be in favor of a large war in the Middle East.
Right, Jeff, I want to talk about one other issue that was on the agenda in Sochi, and that was Venezuela. Russia and the United States on different sides of that crisis, but can they work together to resolve it?
Well, it seems they already are between the very top leaders. Putin and Trump seem to have completely turned around U.S. policy on Venezuela, so right now we're rather in the dark about what that change is. Pompeo went and contradicted Trump himself, so you have two top American leaders saying different things to the same Russian leader who's really playing the whole thing with this. We're not really clear if Trump is having any success persuading the Russians to back off. Rather, it seems Russia is having success in having the Americans back off. So that doesn't seem anywhere consistent with what Bolton, Pompeo, and Trump are pursuing, which is democracy in Venezuela, right. a leader that the people actually voted for instead of the one that the Russians persuaded to stay in power.
Okay. Anton, clearly the Russians or the United States and the Russians in this instance, they want to try and improve relations. Pompeo also had talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is what Putin said afterwards.
As you know, very recently, a couple of days ago, I had the pleasure to speak to the President of the United States over the phone. I developed an impression that Mr. President is set for the restoration of the Russian-American ties, contacts, resolving problems that are important for both sides together. For our part, we have said multiple times that we would also want to regain ties in full.
What are the chances for better relations, given that there are major voices here in the United States that are totally against improving ties?
Right. So, unfortunately, I used to be an optimist, but these days, given the level of distrust of Russia in Washington, D.C., I don't think that whatever comes out of Trump or Pompeo or out of members of his cabinet is really going to be the determinant in terms of what happens between Washington and Moscow. Foreign policy in the United States in general has become sort of bifurcated between the White House, which used to run it for the most part by itself, and Capitol Hill. And now Capitol Hill, Congress claims a lot more influence, especially when it comes to Russia. And I don't think there's really much room for optimism. The fact that everyone's been celebrating Pompeo's first arrival in Russia, and the fact that the two presidents are now finally just speaking on the phone, says a lot about the context and the background. Things have gotten so bad that basic dialogue is already a breakthrough, let alone some kind of constructive decisions.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks a lot to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for watching.